The night drive. Elena Carter collapsed in the hospital corridor. There was still a warm plate of food waiting for her downstairs. She never knew it was there. For the third night in a row, she had told herself she would eat after finishing just one more patient file. One more test result. One more emergency call. One more family who needed someone to explain why their loved one might not make it through the night. But hospitals had a cruel way of turning one more into five more, and five more into midnight. By 11:47 p.m., Elena was sitting alone beneath the harsh fluorescent lights of the emergency department, staring at a computer screen through eyes that could barely stay open. Her stomach cramped, but she ignored it. Her hands trembled slightly as she reached for another chart. Then her vision blurred. The last thing she remembered was the sound of a metal tray falling somewhere behind her and a deep male voice shouting for someone to call a nurse. Before we begin, if you believe kindness can change someone's life, if you believe second chances matter, and if you enjoy emotional stories about ordinary people doing extraordinary things, please take a moment to like this video, share it with someone who needs a little hope today, leave a comment, and subscribe to Kindness Speaks. Your support helps these stories reach people who may need their message more than we realize. Elena had been a doctor for 11 years, but somewhere along the way, she had forgotten how to take care of herself. She had learned medicine because she had once watched her father die in a hospital bed while her family stood helplessly around him. He had been a quiet man who fixed broken appliances for neighbors and refused payment from elderly people who could not afford it. When he became sick, Elena was only 22. She remembered sitting beside him during his final weeks, holding his hand while machines breathed for him. She remembered the smell of antiseptic, the pale blue walls, and the terrible helplessness of knowing that intelligence, money, love, and prayer could not always save a person. After he died, Elena promised herself that she would become the kind of doctor who never made a frightened family feel alone. She kept that promise. Perhaps too well. She worked double shifts. She stayed late. She answered calls on her days off. She learned the names of patients' children, remembered who was afraid of needles, who needed an interpreter, who had no one waiting for them at home. She became known throughout the hospital as the doctor who would come back to check on a patient even after her shift officially ended. But nobody noticed what happened when Elena's own shift ended. She went home to a small apartment where the lights were often off because she rarely arrived before midnight. She slept 4 or 5 hours when she was lucky. Her refrigerator contained bottled water, yogurt, a few apples, and whatever food she remembered to buy during hurried grocery trips. Dinner became something she postponed. Then something she skipped. Then something she stopped thinking about altogether. The hospital cafeteria had become almost empty by the time she finished working each night. But there was one person who noticed. His name was Samuel Brooks. Samuel had been the hospital's executive chef for nearly 15 years. He was 56 years old, broad-shouldered, soft-spoken, and famous for remembering people's favorite meals. He had gray beginning to show at his temples, a neatly trimmed beard, and hands that seemed permanently marked by years of chopping vegetables, carrying heavy pots, and working around hot ovens. Samuel had lost his wife 6 years earlier. After she died, cooking had become more than a profession. It had become the way he survived. His wife had always told him that food was not simply something people put into their bodies. She believed a warm meal could tell someone, without words, that they mattered. Samuel believed her. That was why he noticed Elena. The first time, it was almost midnight when he saw her walk past the cafeteria entrance. She was still wearing her white coat, her dark hair pulled loosely into a tired knot, her shoulders bent beneath the weight of a day that had clearly been too long. Samuel was locking the kitchen. He watched her pass. She stopped for half a second when the smell of roasted chicken drifted into the hallway. Then she kept walking. Samuel frowned. The next night, it happened again. The same woman. The same tired face. The same hesitation. The same empty stomach she pretended not to have. On the third night, Samuel stepped out of the kitchen holding a plate. Elena had just passed the cafeteria when she heard him call after her. She turned. Samuel stood there with a plate covered by a stainless steel lid. He looked at her with the stern expression of a father who had caught a child doing something foolish. He told her she was skipping dinner again. Elena tried to smile and said she was busy. Samuel pointed toward the plate. He told her busy people needed food too. She almost laughed. It was the first time anyone had scolded her in months for something that had nothing to do with medicine. She thanked him but said she would eat later. Samuel shook his head. He told her later was not a meal. Then he handed her the plate. She took it reluctantly. Inside was roasted chicken, mashed potatoes, steamed vegetables, and a small piece of warm bread. It was simple. It was not expensive. But when Elena took her first bite, something inside her nearly broke. It tasted like home. She sat alone at one of the cafeteria tables. Samuel disappeared into the kitchen without saying anything else. Elena ate every bite. The next morning, she returned to the emergency department and went back to saving other people's lives. She thought that was the end of it. It wasn't. The following night, another plate was waiting. Then another. Then another. Sometimes it was chicken and rice. Sometimes soup. Sometimes pasta. Sometimes a simple sandwich with fresh fruit. There was never a note. There was never an explanation. Just a warm plate waiting beneath a lid. Elena began calling it her mysterious dinner. She never asked Samuel directly. And Samuel never asked her why she needed it. For a while, that quiet arrangement became one of the few comforting things in her life. But Elena was carrying a secret. 3 months earlier, her younger brother Michael had called her from another state. Their mother had suffered a stroke. The family had been trying to manage the medical bills, but the rehabilitation costs were overwhelming. Elena had quietly begun sending money every month. She told no one, not her colleagues, not her friends, not even her mother. She had always been the person who helped. She could not bear becoming the person who needed help. So she cut back on everything. Restaurants disappeared. Weekend plans disappeared. New clothes disappeared. Even proper meals disappeared. Every spare dollar went to her family. And every night she convinced herself that hunger was a small price to pay for keeping someone she loved from suffering. But exhaustion does not negotiate. One rainy Tuesday night, Elena was treating an elderly man who had arrived with severe breathing difficulties. His daughter was crying uncontrollably beside the bed. Elena stayed with them for nearly 2 hours. She adjusted medications, ordered tests, called specialists, and explained everything slowly until the frightened daughter finally stopped shaking. When the patient's condition stabilized, Elena stepped into the corridor. The hallway seemed to tilt. She grabbed the wall. Her breathing became shallow. Then her knees gave out. A nurse caught her before her head hit the floor. Within minutes, Elena was lying in an examination room. Dehydration, low blood sugar, severe exhaustion. The doctor treating her told her she needed rest. Elena stared at the ceiling. She wanted to argue, but she was too tired. Samuel heard about it before midnight. He stood inside the kitchen for several minutes without moving. Then he prepared a plate. Not for Elena, for someone else. He packed it carefully and walked upstairs. When he entered the room, Elena was sitting on the edge of the bed, still wearing her white coat. Samuel placed the food beside her. This time, he did not leave. He told her that food could not fix everything. But refusing to eat could make everything worse. Elena looked down. Then, for the first time, she cried. Not loudly. Not dramatically. Just a few silent tears slipping down her cheeks. She admitted that she was tired. Samuel sat in the chair across from her. He told her that being strong did not mean pretending you never needed anyone. Those words stayed with her. But life did not suddenly become easier. The hospital became busier. Elena's mother's rehabilitation expenses increased. Michael lost his job. The apartment rent went up. And then Elena received another piece of bad news. Her mother needed a procedure that insurance would not fully cover. Elena stared at the estimate. It was more money than she had in savings. She sat in her apartment that night surrounded by unpaid bills. For the first time in years, she allowed herself to wonder whether she had made a mistake by choosing medicine. Not because she hated being a doctor. She loved it. She hated what it was costing her. The next evening, she walked into the cafeteria and saw Samuel waiting. There was a plate on the counter. But beside it was something else. An envelope. Elena immediately shook her head. Samuel told her it was not charity. Inside the envelope was a handwritten list of names. Hospital employees, nurses, orderlies, janitors, doctors, technicians, people who had quietly volunteered to contribute to a small emergency fund for Elena's mother. Elena stared at the list in disbelief. She asked how he knew. Samuel smiled. He told her that people notice more than we think. She refused at first. Pride rose inside her like a wall. She said she couldn't accept money from people who were already struggling themselves. Samuel reminded her that she had spent years helping people accept care without making them feel ashamed. Now it was her turn. She began to cry again. This time, she did not hide it. The hospital staff raised enough to cover the procedure. Her mother's surgery went ahead. Weeks later, Elena received a video call. Her mother was sitting upright in a rehabilitation chair. She looked tired, but she was smiling. Elena watched her mother's face on the screen and realized that for the first time in months, she could breathe without feeling as if something was crushing her chest. She thanked everyone, but she never forgot Samuel. Months passed. Elena became healthier. She started eating breakfast. She began taking actual lunch breaks. She learned to leave the hospital before midnight at least a few nights a week. And every evening, Samuel still saved her a plate. Even when she arrived early. Even when she said she wasn't hungry. Even when she insisted she had already eaten. He kept doing it, because Samuel understood something Elena had forgotten. Sometimes love does not arrive with grand speeches. Sometimes it arrives quietly, covered by a stainless steel lid. One ordinary evening, Elena entered the kitchen and noticed Samuel was not there. She asked one of the younger cooks where he was. The cook looked uncomfortable. Samuel had been diagnosed with a serious heart condition. He had been hiding it for months. He was undergoing treatment and had been told he needed surgery. Elena froze. Suddenly, every plate made sense. Every late-night meal. Every stern reminder. Every time Samuel had stood there waiting for her. She realized he had been taking care of everyone while quietly carrying his own fear. The next morning, Elena went to Samuel's home. She brought groceries. She brought medication. She brought paperwork. And she brought food. Samuel opened the door and stared at her. She smiled. She told him that skipping meals was no longer allowed. For the first time, Samuel laughed. His surgery was scheduled for the following week. Elena made sure he never went through it alone. She spoke to his doctors. She helped organize his medications. She sat beside him before surgery. And when Samuel woke up, Elena was there. The relationship between them had changed. It was no longer a chef saving dinner for a tired doctor. It was two exhausted human beings learning how to care for each other. Samuel eventually returned to the hospital. His recovery was slow. He could not work full shifts immediately. But when he finally walked back into the kitchen, the staff applauded. Elena was standing near the doorway. Samuel looked at her. Then he lifted a stainless steel lid. Underneath was a plate. Chicken. Mashed potatoes. Vegetables. Bread. Elena laughed through tears. Some things, apparently, never changed. Years later, Elena became the director of emergency medicine. She still worked hard, but she no longer confused exhaustion with dedication. She created a hospital program called the Open Plate. It provided free meals for exhausted hospital workers who could not afford cafeteria food or who simply forgot to eat during long shifts. Samuel became its first honorary director. The program eventually expanded to include night shift workers, cleaners, security guards, paramedics, and families staying with critically ill patients. One plate became hundreds. Hundreds became thousands. And every plate carried the same message. You matter. One winter evening, Elena stood in the hospital cafeteria watching a young resident sit alone at a table. The resident looked exhausted. She had dark circles beneath her eyes and untouched paperwork spread across the table. A moment later, Samuel walked out of the kitchen. He placed a covered plate in front of her. Then he pointed at the food with the same stern expression he had once used on Elena. The young doctor smiled. Elena watched from a distance. And suddenly, she understood the real meaning of what had happened all those years ago. Samuel had never simply been saving her dinner. He had been saving a small piece of her humanity. He had reminded her that caregivers needed care too. That strong people needed somewhere to lean. That accepting kindness was not weakness. And that sometimes the smallest gesture can interrupt the darkest season of someone's life. If this story touched your heart, please don't just watch and scroll away. Like the video, share it with someone who needs a reminder that they matter, and subscribe to Kindness Speaks for more stories about compassion, hope, second chances, and the quiet kindness that can change a life. And before you leave, I have one special request. In the comments, write, "Everyone deserves a saved plate." Write it for someone who has cared for everyone else while quietly struggling themselves. Write it for the exhausted mother, the overworked father, the lonely nurse, the tired doctor, the person who always says, "I'm fine," even when they are not. Because you never know who might read those words at midnight and realize that someone, somewhere, still believes they deserve kindness. And perhaps that was the greatest lesson Elena ever learned. Sometimes saving a life does not begin with medicine. Sometimes it begins with noticing. Noticing the person who always skips dinner. Noticing the eyes that look tired. Noticing the smile that is starting to disappear. And sometimes, the most powerful thing you can say to someone who has spent their entire life taking care of others is simply this: you don't have to carry everything alone. There is a plate waiting for you. And you are worth saving, too.